So today we will finish at 19 at 7 o'clock Istanbul time. So now the platform for Patrick, will you please introduce yourself and start your keynote until the lunchtime. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, TÜZDER. I'm Patrick Blessinger, president of HETL, also an adjunct professor at St. John's University and the State University of New York at Old Westbury, where I teach graduate courses, masters, and doctoral students in different education courses, a whole variety of education courses, from learning difficulties to pedagogy to educational leadership. And also just want to mention that I'm also the editor of a journal of Applied Research in Higher Education. It's a Q2 journal in Scopus. And so if you're looking for a venue for any of your research papers, you're more than welcome to submit them there for consideration. So today I'm going to talk about higher education's role in the emerging environmental revolution. Okay, so I think, as everyone probably knows, in 2015, just 7 years ago, the United Nations launched their Agenda 2030. The Agenda 2030 is just another name for the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And that, 7 years on, we can look at, I think, and certainly history will tell us, I think, that it will be a watershed moment in human history. It's one of those reset points that doesn't come along very long. Perhaps the last reset point that we had in human history was probably World War II. After World War II, given the global scale of the conflict and everything that happened during then, all the atrocities, all the human rights abuses, etc., the world finally came to its senses in 1945 and said, you know, this is enough. We have to, it's time the world come together. It's time that we create a global organization so that these sorts of atrocities don't happen again, and this kind of global conflicts don't happen again. The United Nations was the result, along with several other international organizations like the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, etc. Okay, I think probably 20 or 30 years from now we'll look back and I think we'll see that 2015 and the development of the Sustainable Development Goals will also be another reset point in human history, a point where, you know, we came to our senses again and said we have to do something about the climate change that is occurring, and the global warming, the pollution, etc. Higher ed, I think, has probably come to the party a little late, but better late than never. Okay, and 7 years on, I think we're seeing now higher ed starting to gain some traction in really having an awareness and come to the realization that, you know, we need to get involved. Higher education needs to get involved. Institutional leaders need to have an understanding of sustainable development, the goals in particular, why they're necessary, and you know, take concrete action. Okay, we can get to the next slide. All right, so this is in line with what all the earlier speakers have talked about. Right now, we're in 4.0, okay? And it's a very useful framework. If you go back to, this all starts with the Industrial Revolution of the late 1700s, around 1770, right around there, is a crucial period. By the way, that was another major reset point in human history. Probably the one, you know, these are the three major reset points in the last 250 years. the Industrial Revolution, let's just say circa 1800, World War II, 1945, and then the Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals 2015. But it all started with the Industrial Revolution. And if you look at the data going back thousands of years, you'll see that GDP, if you want to look at it from an economic perspective, but you can look at this from any number of perspectives, or just quality of life indexes, was very flat throughout most of human history, if you want to go back 50, 60,000 years. But then once the Industrial Revolution started, circa 1800, then for the first time in human history, we, as societies started to become more developed and more industrialized, we saw GDP per capita start to go up. And so there's a lot of positive outcomes from since the Industrial Revolution. Also, coincidentally, when the Industrial Revolution took place, roughly 1770, 1775, that was also the time of our first, well, maybe not the first, but at least the first, our modern democracy with the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, and then the French Revolution, which followed very closely. So in the span of about 5 or 10 years, you had this major industrial revolution taking place, you had this democratic revolution taking place at the same time, and they fed off of each other, okay? And all the research and the data, supports this. Then fast forward to the 1800s, mid to late 1800s, and then because societies started to become more industrialized, there was a need for better educated workers and employees. Around 1800, the average lifespan of a human being, the global lifespan of a human being, was about 28 years old. That is, if you were born in 1800, your likelihood of surviving past 20 years of age was not that good. Okay, but then because of all the developments, technological developments, scientific developments, in healthcare, et cetera, that have happened over the last 200 years, especially in the 20th century, we've seen the average life expectancy go up dramatically. Now, I think the global average is around 65 or 70. So that's a massive increase. And we've seen human intelligence, if you measure them by IQ scores, go up massively in all continents, okay? So what's the short of all this? Okay, what's the, I guess the bottom line to all of this? That there's been a tremendous amount of good that is, that mankind has benefited from since the Industrial Revolution. It's not all good. There have been good outcomes politically, good outcomes economically, good outcomes socially and culturally, good outcomes technologically, but all of that more or less has been done at the expense of the environment. The environment has really been an afterthought, okay, in our rush to industrialize and improve, the quality of life and the standard of living for people around the world. We've largely ignored the impact on the environment that all that industrialization, all the pollution, all the carbon emissions was having on the environment. It was an unintended consequence. Okay. Well, now, over the last 50 years, I'd say, because of our advances in scientific knowledge, our ability to measure and have concrete data about climate change and temperature increases and carbon emissions that are trapping the greenhouse effect and that are trapping heat within the Earth's atmosphere. Now we can no longer claim ignorance that we don't know the impact on the environment. And all of that has, led up to the UN passing the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so this is a useful framework, as previous speakers talked about, and also showed you, with the Industry 1.0, Industry 2.0, Industry 3, 4. We're also now, because we're in the year 2022, starting to talk about Industry 5.0. We're not quite there yet, but it's being discussed. Probably around 2030 is when we're going to see Industry 5.0 start to emerge. Because all of these macro systems are interlinked, the political global system, economic global system, it's what we call the PESTE model, PESTE model, okay, political, economic, social, technological, and environmental. All these macro systems forces, they're macro forces, are interlinked. So what happens in one sphere will impact the other spheres also, just like we talked about the unintended consequence of the industrial and political revolutions that have had on the environment. So it's a very kind of, it is a simplified model, but that's what even the best theories are simplified theories, right? They simplify reality, which can be enormously complex. But it's in that simplification, not simplistic, simple, very big difference. But in that simplification, we can have a better understanding of how these complex systems are work and interact with each other. And they also correspond with other areas like University 4.0 that was talked about, or some people call it Education 4.0, if you want to include the K-12 or basic education space. Web 4.0, and the list goes on and on. Okay. Okay, you can probably go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these, don't have enough time, plus other speakers have kind of touched upon them. But here is just some useful, and I've attached some time frames to them. So, the first industrial revolution, of course, was in Britain. Started in 1760. That was mainly characterized by mechanization of manufacturing technologies, tools, machinery, steam engines. It was the steam engine. That was really the major mechanism, for driving that first industrial revolution. And all of these feed upon each other, and they serve as a base for the next revolution to come about, because they're all based on knowledge, and knowledge feeds on itself, okay, in a virtuous cycle, if you will. The second industrial revolution, go back, occurred in 1870 or thereabouts. These are circa approximately, okay, so these are approximate dates. That was also known as the technological revolution, characterized by diffusion of electrification, okay? We learned how to harness electricity, okay? And in mass production, mass transportation, trains, mass communication systems, the telegraph and the telephone. The telephone, by the way, was, I think that was in the 1880s, okay? AT&T, I believe, was the first commercial telephone company, who was Alexander Graham Bell. I think he's credited for developing that. And then we fast forward to the third industrial revolution, 1960, also known as the digital revolution. So now we have the creation of computers, digital computers in particular. And this was also known as the information age, okay? So digitization has had an enormous impact on transforming the world, our lives. Everything we're doing right here, is based on digital technology. But third revolution electronics, computers, robotics. I'm old enough, by the way, to remember the first computer, personal computer that is, came out. The computer was created, well, depending on how you want to define it, but I guess the first modern computer was invented in the 1940s. And personal computers came around in the mid 70s. I was really intrigued when they came out, and when so I guess it was 1979, 1980, when the Atari 64 came out. I saved up my money and rushed down to the local electronics store and bought one. Now the internet, that's different from the web. Okay, so I guess I'm giving a little history lesson here too. Okay, the web is the graphical user interface that sits on top of the internet. Okay, the web was created, or more specifically, the HTML protocol was developed by Tim Berners-Lee, I guess in the late 80s, but the internet actually goes back to 1969. That was a project by the US DoD, Department of Defense, the DARPA project, Defense, I forget the acronym stands for, but it was an advanced research project agency. That's what the ARPA stands for. And I think it's the Defense Agency Research Project Agency. But they developed the internet. They wanted a secure way in case there was a nuclear fallout. Remember, this was during the Cold War, and everyone was terribly afraid that we were going to get into a nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union at the time. And so the Defense Department created a project to start the internet, which was, they wanted a way to create a redundant system in the case of a nuclear fallout, that if this site went down, the electronic system of communication would still work. Okay, so they did that based on packet switching technology, as I'm sure most of you are aware, and it worked fundamentally different than the way the voice telecom system worked, which was based, at that point anyhow, on an analog system. But anyhow, so the internet can go back to the 1969, 1970. The web, so it was in use for, I guess, what, two decades before the web came about. Then when the web came about, and really the first web browser, which, what was that? Netscape, I think, I forget, in the early 90s, then it really started to take off. Okay, next slide. Now we're in the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, also known as Industry 4.0, characterized by hyperconnectivity and integration of biological, physical, and digital systems. Again, everyone feeds upon itself. Everyone acts as they take all the developments that occurred, before, and they build upon that, right? So we're in the era right now of the Internet of Things, where everything's going to be connected. If you have an iWatch or a smart watch, a phone, your refrigerator, your oven, your house, your security system, your computer, everything that is electronic will probably have an IP address and will have the potential being connected. Okay, and so that's being built out, at a very, very fast rate. The other interesting thing to note, if you just take a step back and you kind of look at all of these revolutions at a, like a 10,000-foot view, and you kind of do a thematic analysis, and you kind of look at the themes that are going on here. Each one, as each new revolution takes place, the time frame, gets shorter and shorter, right? Because you have more knowledge. Knowledge builds upon itself. Knowledge feeds on itself, okay? And so when we went from industry, 1.0 to 2.0, there was a long time frame, like 100 years, okay? But as each new revolution takes place, that time frame between revolutions seems to get shorter, which makes sense, right? We're also in the age of nanotechnology, big data. You've heard about this. Some of you do research in this area. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, That's going to be a game changer. It already is now that we've mapped the human genome, and there's going to be a lot more, genetic engineering take place, human machine interfaces, all sorts of medical applications, inserting electronic devices inside the body, in the brain. We already do that in the heart with pacemakers. It will continue to get more and more advanced. Okay. The fifth industrial revolution, we're probably looking at around 2030. We could call that Industry 5.0, and that will probably be characterized, again, more human-machine cooperation, personalization, so-called mass customization, and the list goes on. Okay. So all of these, have created what we call a global knowledge society. Oftentimes they refer to it as a global knowledge economy. Okay, I tend to prefer the term global knowledge society, since that, to me, that's a little bit more broad and more inclusive of all the different spheres, including the economy. Okay, next slide. All right, so if we look at the data, and I love data, I'm a data guy, I'm data driven, I do the research. Even if I write a simple 800-word article for university news, world news, for example, I'll spend it will take me 10 or 15 hours to write. The first 5 hours is just looking at the data, right? Researching the data, reading up on it, making sure I actually understand what I'm talking about, before I start typing words, into a Word document. So if we look at the data, and this comes from the site Our World in Data, which is a very useful site. I think they're either out of Oxford or Cambridge, but Max Roser is the guy who developed this years ago, and he's really developed it into a fantastic resource of data. They get their source data from reliable sources like the UN, World Bank, and OECD, and other trusted sources. And if you look at this in the historical index of human development, how much time do I have? How much time do you have? I still get 20 minutes. Okay. So if you look at this is an interesting, and it just shows a sample. Of course, you can't fit all the countries on here. It would be such a mess that you wouldn't be able to interpret it. So we only have a sample of countries here. And so if you look at, my main concern is not so much the countries, but the trend, right? I like looking at trends, right? If you want to understand where the future is going, it helps to look at historical trends, right? And unless there is some major cataclysmic event, reset point, that happens, like a nuclear holocaust, right? Or we're hit with another asteroid the size of the one that killed the dinosaurs a long time ago. If you look at the historical data, then, there's a pretty good chance that it will continue, into the future. So look, this goes back to 1870. That's roughly at the start of the second industrial revolution. And you can see that, for most countries, probably for, if not all countries, to one degree or another, there have been improvements in human development in terms of literacy, in terms of health, and any other metric that you want to, measure human development on. Of course, you have to look at you also have to take a systems approach, at looking at this, because one infographic or one chart doesn't tell you everything you need to know. It's only one piece of the puzzle. Because the reality is there's still about 700 million people, children in the world that are illiterate. They still cannot read and write. 700 million out of the 8 billion people that are on the planet. Okay, so these trends are good, and there have been a lot of positives as a result of industrialization, let's say, and technology development, et cetera, and universal basic education and human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights that came out of the UN back in the 40s But there's still a lot of work to do because there's still a lot of, again, a lot of illiteracy out there. There's still a lot of hunger and extreme poverty out there. So still a lot of work to do. And that's where the Sustainable Development Goals come in. The Agenda 2030. They address the Sustainable Development Goals are not just about climate change. That's just one aspect of it. They also have goals that cover poverty and, literacy and all these other problems that still plague humanity. Okay, next one. And so here you can see that this is the life expectancy at birth. So now you can see that women outlive men on average, okay, I guess by about 5 or 6 years. And that trend, what's interesting about that particular metric is that that's been true for, our recent history. This goes back to 1950, but I've looked at the data going back to 1800, where the life expectancy was 28 years old. So that's a huge improvement in just a little over 200 years, all right, to go from 28 years to almost 70 years life expectancy. That is a massive improvement, okay? All right, next slide. So what we've seen, in recent history is the emergence of this global knowledge society, right? Because all development, when you break it down, get to its most fundamental level, because I'm always looking for, like any, researcher, looking for underlying mechanisms, okay? What is actually driving all this data? What are the underlying causes or principles that's driving, this to occur? And knowledge is one of those, okay? So, one of the main things that cuts across these revolutions is the speed of technology adoption that I talked about earlier, okay? There's been an exponential growth in the global knowledge base, okay? Because again, knowledge feeds upon itself. That's what we do as researchers, as innovators, as educators, right? We look at research that's already been done in journals, in books, and articles, and then we want to build upon that, right? So in order to build upon it, you have to first of all know what is the existing knowledge base, right? And then once you know what the existing knowledge base says, then you can start working on the gaps, filling in the gaps, identifying the gaps in the knowledge. And so that creates what I call a virtuous cycle of innovation and knowledge production, all right, leading to this hyper-connected, hyper-independent global knowledge society. But it also leads, again, to these, what we could call unintended consequences of complexity. The world is getting more complex by the minute, by the hour, by the day, by the year. It gets more and more complex because more knowledge is generated, okay? We have a better understanding of the world. We have a much better understanding of human genetics, broadly speaking, and genetics in particular. We've mapped the human genome. We're continuing to fine tune that, however. So we understand a lot of the complexity. Our understanding of the complexity gets better every day. But it also reveals just how much complex the world actually is, okay? And so increasing complexity leads to greater uncertainty, which leads to greater risk, right? Because risk by definition, or at least one definition, is uncertainty. Risk is a measure of uncertainty, right? So now risk management, for example, that's why insurance is so, all different forms of insurance are so popular right now. They're a form of risk management. That's why education is so important, right? Especially basic education, but increasingly even higher education, okay? And when I say higher education, I mean tertiary education. That's inclusive of further education, continuing education, technical schools, just anything post-secondary, okay? So more complexity tends to create more uncertainty, which tends to create more risk, okay? So these are the kinds of sort of relationships and trends that I look for when I'm looking at all of this data, okay? So one of the, in education, by the way, is a form of risk management, okay? If you want to think of it like that now, if you want to think of it like that, because it's an insurance policy. When you educate a kid, he's really developing an insurance policy to guard against future uncertainty. How does he do that? Well, by becoming an educated, knowledgeable human being who's capable of, self-regulation, okay? Capable of self-learning, capable of a high degree of personal agency, okay? And so that's what, again, if you break it down to its most fundamental bare essence and look at the underlying mechanism, that's, I think, what it's all about, okay? Next slide. Okay, so more on the knowledge society, which we are deep into. We live, of course, we're all familiar with globalization. The whole topic of globalization was super hot back in the 80s and 90s. Many of you remember Thomas Friedman coming out with the book, the Earth is Flat or the World is Flat, okay? That's all it's about. He was just talking about, globalization. It was not a new concept. Other people had written about it, but he had written about it in a way and had come up with a catchy title, okay? So as much marketing as it was anything else, that it caught, and they put it out there at the right time, that it kind of caught the public imagination, and so it became very successful, all right? We've talked a lot about today, about creativity, critical thinking. Really, that's what Bloom's taxonomy is all about, if you're familiar with that. Because what is at the top of Bloom's taxonomy? It's creativity, it's creation, it's producing a product. And that's what, the earlier speakers were talking about also. What's at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy? It's knowledge, because it's the base, okay? But if you stop at just being a consumer of knowledge, okay, then you're going to get stuck at level 1, right? And we don't want our students being stuck at level 1. However important that is, that's extremely important, because you can't go to the higher levels unless you have a really good knowledge base, okay? Unless you're engaged in mastery learning and are engaged in a rigorous program of knowledge acquisition, but it's got to go beyond that, right? You have to be able to know how to use it, right? In innovative and creative ways, in rigorous ways. You have to know how to analyze data, apply it in very complex situations, okay? And then ultimately go from, in addition to being a critical thinker, being a creative thinker, right? Where you're actually producing something that is unique, innovative, and new. You're producing new knowledge, And so there's a big trend right now around the world for the last 20 or 30 years, maybe more, undergraduate research. Some of you may be involved in that, that's its goal, right? Undergraduate research, for example, is how do you gauge undergraduate students in the research process, okay? There are different ways to do that. But the whole idea behind that is that you're taking them from just being knowledge consumers to knowledge producers, right? And that's a very different way of thinking, right? It's a very different mindset, right? But I, strongly believe that we should be producing students who are knowledge producers, right? Not just consumers of knowledge. Because the fact is, okay, in this day and age, and the earlier speakers talked about this, okay? Students do not go to university to access knowledge. They don't, because they can get that knowledge anywhere. They already have access to knowledge, okay? The Harvard's edX, Coursera, MIT's OpenCourseWare, where MIT in 2004 or 5, thereabouts, put all of their content, their entire curriculum online for free for anyone, okay? So the content is out there, free for everyone, and it should be, okay? Everyone already has access to knowledge, okay? That's not why kids go to university and higher learning. They want more than just access, right? They want to be part of a rigorous process where they have professors and educators and other people that will, will help them become critical and creative thinkers, right? Help them move up that taxonomy of higher education, of learning objectives, okay? There are other reasons also, right? They want the degree, of course, right, for employment reasons, and that's just the practical reality, okay? And so undergraduate research, that's a very good program. I've co-edited a book on that, and it came out 3 or 4 years ago, okay, with Routledge. Also, I co-authored a paper on not transdisciplinary, but interdisciplinary undergraduate research, and that came out last month. That's in the Cambridge handbook on undergraduate research. So we know, we have a pretty good idea of how we can create a really good, effective, high-performing university system that is student-centered, that is based on engaged learning, but we have to, but the implementation of it, that's a little bit tougher, right? But all the research is out there, okay? So the next big challenge for educational institutions, apart from their pedagogical, and research functions, is become more socially responsible institutions, more socially engaged. And this has to do with the third part of that, their remit or mission, that is their service mission. And so this is now, we're starting to see, this gaining more traction, okay? Where university leaders are finally starting to become more aware of the need to lead their institution in this particular area, right? To adopt the sustainable development goals from an institutional level, but also to break it down and to start, integrating those principles and those goals into the curriculum, right? There's education for sustainable development, ESD. A lot of research going on in this area right now. But we are in the midst of an environmental revolution, right? And higher education needs to be involved in that, both at the leadership level and at the faculty level. And we're gonna see some amazing things come out of this environmental revolution, right? We're already seeing amazing things with electric vehicles, for example. And some states, I think like California, I read, have mandated that all vehicles sold in the state of California have to be electric, I think by 2030 or 2035. So governments are starting to take it serious, and higher education institutions are a little late to the party, but better late than never. I'm starting to see some traction there also. Yeah. Okay, so how much time? Okay. How many more slides do I have? It doesn't matter. Okay, I'll fast forward. Okay, so let's see here. So there's a lot to unpack when we're talking about the environment, okay? We've seen in the past few hundred years, the so-called unintended consequence of industrialization is the wide-scale destruction of biodiversity, okay? Just the total obliteration of many ecosystems, species extinctions, massive deforestation, and the result of all of that has been global warming, right? greenhouse gases, methane, and carbon dioxide in particular, those molecules that trap heat, okay? You produce more of those, then of course the global temperature will rise. That has enormous implications for rising water, sea levels, melting polar ice caps, the list goes on and on and on. And now the good news is that that when the world community is confronting with, really massive problems, they do and they can come together, okay? So after World War II, the world came together, right? And created the United Nations. They created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, okay? And since then, over the last 75, 80 years, they've done a lot of good, in these areas, raising world consciousness about all these different problems that are confronting humanity. There was, the destruction of the ozone that was occurring, and in the 60s and the 70s, I remember that growing up. And then the CFCs, the production of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, that are, destroying the ozone layer, which is very important, okay? And the world came together and they banned CFCs. And you saw the curve if you look at the data. I don't know if I got that curve in here, but it just, once they started banning those CFCs, it just a matter of several years, and now it's almost down to zero. So the world can come together and make the right decisions, but unfortunately, sometimes they wait almost until the last minute before they do that. Okay, so mainstreaming sustainable development, has increasingly become a matter of survival. Okay, all right, next one. Oh, here. Okay, so here the global atmospheric CO2 concentration, and you can see it's been fairly stable for hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, one of the things to keep in mind is that the Earth is 4.56 billion years old. It's taken 4.5 billion years to create this paradise of a planet where these ecosystems and the Earth itself has become fine-tuned for life, okay? And that has been the case for the last hundreds of thousands of years. Then we fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, okay? And you see the spike go up. So in a matter of about 200 years, we've made a lot of improvements to the humankind and the planet, but unfortunately that came at the expense of the environment. So now we have to do something about that, and it's not too late. Okay, here you see the global warming trend since 1880. Okay, now 1 degree may not seem like a lot. Okay, but it's significant. When you get up to 2 or 3 degrees, even at 1 degree, we're feeling the impact. Wait until we get to 3 degrees or 4 degrees, okay? We'll really feel the impact, okay? Next slide. All right, and so this shows if we stay at our current policies, we can expect maybe a 2.5 degree increase in average global temperatures. That will have a huge impact. If we don't put in place any global climate policies, that's going to go up to 4 or 5%. Okay, so the world is taking it seriously, but I think we need to take it more seriously, and everyone needs to do their part, including higher education. Okay, next slide. Here's the slide on the ozone depleting substances. So you can see that in the 1990s, late 1980s, we finally got together. We came up with an international ban on ozone destroying substances, ozone depleting substances. like the chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, and others. And you can see, you know, just in a matter of a few decades, we've pretty much eliminated the problem. So it can be done. The science is there. It's not a scientific problem, right? We have the science. We have the data. It's unequivocal. Okay, it's the will. Do we have the will to do something about it? The will to trust the data, believe in the data, and the will to, you know, actually take action and do something. Okay, next. Okay, how many minutes? We're done. Okay. All right, then we're done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your valuable contributions to the society. We'll just give you your gifts and certificates and things if you can just come out.